Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for checking into the channel. Matthew here. Today we're talking to Darryl Burling. Darryl, what's going on in your part of the world over there in New Zealand? How's the weather this time of year?
It's beautiful. It is in the mid to high 80s, I guess. Most or mid 80s probably is better. And overnight, it's still in the 70s. It's really nice. It's a great time of year. So just like winter is like the coldest time of the year in the North American area. So for February here is the warmest part of the year for us. So it's great.
I like how you calibrated that to Fahrenheit for us. You probably use Celsius though over there, don't you, or no?
We do, yeah. But when I lived in the States for 4 years, so I got to sort of get used to Fahrenheit, and most of our customers are based in the US as well. So it kind of comes quite naturally now to automatically convert things. And, I'm not perfect at it, but having lived there for 4 years, you kind of get used to 32 being zero and, everything above 75 being comfortable. So, well, at least till you get into the, high 80s, early 90s kind of thing anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we Americans, we're terrible at this. We only know our own set of temperatures. We only know our own set of measurements. If you were to tell me you were driving 55 kilometers per hour, I would have no idea whether I should buckle up or hang on to the safety bar up there. Or we don't think in those terms. We typically only speak one language, which is English, and we're very just kind of monocultural like that. But everywhere else you go, people seem to be able to switch back and forth and toggle back and forth
Mm.
with that kind of stuff. Now, you were in America for how long?
4 years from 2011, 2010 to 2015. Yeah, middle of 2010 to middle of 2015. It sounds like 5 years, doesn't it? Something like that. Anyway, yeah.
Now, most people would recognize that your accent is not from West Virginia. You were born and raised in New Zealand. Is that primarily where you've lived the most of your life, or besides your time in America, have you ever lived anywhere else?
Not lived. I've been to a couple other places, but no, I've lived in New Zealand pretty much all my life. And, I guess that makes me a small town boy. I did live in Wellington, which is our second-ish biggest city, but it's not a big city. It's 450,000 people live there, pretty much. That's it. So it's a pretty smallish kind of city by American standards, but it's pretty large by New Zealand standards. And I spent, I don't know, 12, 13 years living there. And then we
Okay.
moved and we've just been living in small town New Zealand pretty much ever since. So yeah, but 4 years in the States, loved my time there. It was kind of sad to go home. My family was really thrilled to go home, but I would have been quite happy to stick it out a bit longer.
Now, again, we Americans, we're so monocultural. I think mostly of the Lord of the Rings and the settings and places where that was filmed. Is that what the whole place looks like, or are there different kind of topographies, different kind of layouts and setting, or is it all just that beautiful? Because it's some of the most beautiful lay of the land that I've ever seen, at least on film. What's it really like?
Yeah, I think so if you look at the big sweeping shots you see in Lord of the Rings, those are all South Island, kind of those big open areas. There are like, but having said that, like the River Anduin, where when Sam and Frodo were rescued by Arwen, they filmed that scene like I used to go for runs past that spot
Hmm.
occasionally.
Hmm.
The area where they filmed Orthanc, where there was in the extra additional, like the extended edition, I think there's a scene between Gandalf and Saruman, before Saruman turned, and that was filmed just over the road from us in a park. And then Helm's Deep was filmed just down the road. That's not very pretty, of course, but that was just I used to drive past Helm's Deep on my way to work, kind of thing. So the filming itself takes place over a really wide area. Even not Lothlorien, where Elrond and Rivendell, that's it. Rivendell was filmed
Yes.
like 20 minutes up the road from where I lived as well. So
No
so
kidding.
so there are some so most of New Zealand is pretty beautiful, I think, generally speaking. There are some urban areas and we've got a desert kind of thing that's not that bad either, I guess. It's certainly nicer than the California desert, Mojave Desert. So yeah, I think generally speaking, I would say it's pretty nice, but don't expect those big, Queenstown sweeping shots everywhere you turn.
Now, are people there pretty fond of the Lord of the Rings series? Are you pretty proud of that as a kind of a cultural export to the rest of the world? Because I think that those movies have not been surpassed in terms of like the scope of the storytelling and just the gosh, the costumes, the
Mm,
even some of the CGI animation was really well done. And these movies are like 20 years old by now, if I'm not
I
mistaken.
know.
Are New Zealanders pretty proud of that set of movies?
Yeah, I think so. Generally speaking, I mean, there's two things, right? One, it does a good job of showing off our country. It does a great job of showing off the capabilities and things that we can pull off. And to be able to, I mean, New Zealanders really love to be, to sort of be the center of attention on the world stage. And it happens, in a few small spheres. And I think in terms of filmmaking, this would be a pinnacle for us in a lot of ways. I mean, it was huge here. I remember lining up on the streets as they had the parades when they did the opening of it and everything. It was a big event, and I think, New Zealand still benefits from it, and we really do. So yes, and we all love Peter Jackson. Doesn't matter what he's done since or how badly
Yeah.
people think The Hobbit was, we still love it. So
Yeah.
generally speaking, yeah, we rate it really highly.
It's funny if you ever live anywhere near where a movie's filmed, especially if that movie kind of makes it into any sort of like cultural cachet where it becomes something like a cult classic,
Mm,
people will stream to that place for years and years. In
yeah.
fact, here in just north of Pittsburgh, we are close to the filming of that classic horror movie, Night of the Living Dead. It's just down the road, and it was
Uh,
filmed at a cemetery that's on kind of a high points on the like a peak of a hill.
mm,
And every single day, tourists will be driving up that winding road up to the top of the cemetery to look and try to stand exactly where film was seen, where the first zombie, kind comes out of the cemetery. It's just funny how movies are like remembered for the scenes. People will go and they'll stand exactly where scenes were. When I was living in Florida, Edward Scissorhands was filmed really, really close to where I lived, and they
mm,
had, painted those houses in a pastel color, and then later on they sold them or repainted them or whatever. But people would still go there all the time just to
yeah.
stand where, those kind of scenes were filmed. So I imagine that any tourist that goes to New Zealand is probably going to want to go see some of those sites, even position themselves in
Yeah.
juxtaposition to where, the tower was or the battle was filmed or whatever. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And we actually there was a lull for a bit, but they ran after it was all published and finished, they ran a Lord of the Rings tours for a little while. They kind of died in, for a little bit, but they're back again, and people are coming to New Zealand just to do this Lord of the Rings tour, and it literally takes them across the whole country. So you see all the different places where everything was filmed, and you stand in the locations and all that kind of thing. So, and there's even still some bits and pieces like Rivendell. You can still go to Rivendell, and there's like a walkthrough sort of thing there that the local uh, government has sort of put in just to sort of give people an idea of where everything was with some photos and things like that. So you can sort of stand in one place and you can see this is what it looked like on the set. The set's not there, but there's elements still sort of being left there, like there's a big gate there and things like that. So it's still a lot of fun to see. And I'm sure there's other spots around the country just like that as well. I haven't been to the South Island for a little bit. And when I was last there, even though it was after the rings were done, it was I didn't go stopping in a lot of those spots, although it's not hard to go view them. So yeah, definitely we get a tourist element from that.
Now, where were you when the movies were being filmed? Were you here in the United States or were you there during the time of the filming? Did you have any idea that these movies were going to be as big as they were?
Yeah, so we lived in New Zealand when the movies were being filmed. We lived in Upper Hutt at the time, and there was one night we were hosting a home group Bible study in our home, and we heard this racket outside. We weren't sure what it was, and it was dark, so we looked out. But we looked out opened the curtain and looked out the window. And we saw this light off in the distance, and there's this noise over there. We're like, oh, I wonder what's going on there. And that was the night they were filming the scene where they were chopping down the trees at
Oh,
Orthanc for Saruman's scene and filming that scene. So that's what all the noise was, and literally, like I said, in the park over the road from us. That was all being filmed. So yeah, that was, and like I drove past Helm's Deep every
hmm.
day after they finished filming and before they finished filming and all those kinds of things. And you could sort of see the progress of them building it and then taking it down afterwards as well. So yeah, definitely.
Well, gosh, we could talk about all that all day. That is such an
Yeah.
interesting topic, and maybe Lord willing, one day we will do that. But today, actually, you and I are going to talk about New Testament Greek. So, Darryl, how is it that you fell in love with the languages of the scriptures and particularly New Testament Greek? How did that happen in your life?
Yeah, so I was not raised in a Christian home or anything like that. I was anyway, a bunch of experiences kind of thing, in terms of like interactions with scripture and whatnot as a kid. But then when I was a teenager, I started my first job, and a friend of mine from school, his parents became Christians, and then they went off to Bible college for a week to sort of check out should they do this. And while they were there, I stayed with my friend, and there was a Bible next to the bed I was sleeping in. I opened it up, and I sort of skimmed past the Old Testament, which I'd read a little bits of when I was a kid, got to about Exodus 30 something, and it got too hard for an 8-year-old brain. So I just skimmed through, found this piece called the New Testament, and started reading, and I was struck by the authority of Christ, particularly, and convicted of my sin. And the end of that week, a guy came through town, and they invited me to church. So family came back. They invited me to go to their church. I went along. I went along in the evening. It was great because this guy was a pretty good preacher. And in the evening, my friend said, "Oh, do you want to talk to the preacher?" And I said, "He doesn't want to talk to me." But of course, he went off and got him anyway. And he led me to pray to receive Christ. And that was basically the start of how I became a Christian. The the love for the New Testament, I mean, I just love scripture from that point on, really. It was just a process of discovery. And then once I was working for Microsoft, and I was thinking, yeah, I'd really like to learn to read the original language, because I had all these things about translations, and I keep getting stuck on, well, this translation's clearer. I found the New American Standard much clearer than, say, the NIV.
Hmm.
But it was like, well, if I can get this out of the New American Standard, surely just reading the Greek could be even better. So I had a crack at teaching myself some Greek. I had no education at this point, so I had no idea what I was doing. So I got Mount, so I got his workbook, I got his cards, I got the whole thing. And yeah, that was just too hard. It was just, how do you go from no education to sort of doing this work and knowing how you're going with it and all that kind of thing. So it was too hard, too hard. I kind of gave it up. But then long after that, I thought, what, maybe I should just go to seminary. And that led me to come to the States to go to seminary. I did Greek while I was in my undergraduate degree, and it was two 8-week classes. And then I did Greek again, Greek exegesis during my seminary program. So I did about 5 classes there as well. And it was interesting. I found when I was I loved all of that. It was fantastic all the way through. But I found that, and this is the thing, I still wanted to read the New Testament in Greek. And I found that as I learned the language, I wasn't really being taught how to read the language. And so for me, it really started with that whole idea of, well, how do I actually do this? And so while I was at seminary, I came up with the process in order to test out of Greek. So even though I did my undergraduate degree at Masters University and did Greek there, I still had to pass the test to test out of Greek for seminary, for Master's Seminary. So I was studying for this, and what I did is I asked, what's the exam about? They said, oh, you got to read and translate First John. I said, okay, cool. So I got the basics. I went and learned all the vocabulary for First John, and got it to a point where I could sort of muddle my way through okay. Not as good as I think I should have been able to now looking back, but good enough. And I passed the exam. And that led to, as we went into exegesis classes, we were supposed to do the same thing, read through after we'd finished the Greek exegesis part of the course, read through, say, First Thessalonians together and talk through it. And so what I did is I learned the vocabulary for First Thessalonians, and this became a sort of a habit. And I thought, well, if I can learn the vocabulary for these things, because I found that because I was able to do that, I could ace those classes really well. And so that just led me on this, okay, I'll just keep going with this. And so develop, and then I thought, well, hang on, if I'm going to keep going with this, I should sort of think about getting rid of the words I already learned rather than learning them again. And bear in mind, this was in the day before the, multiplication of apps and everything. And so it sort of came to this point of like, well, let's just make a system so that I can learn every word in the New Testament without learning it twice, and learn them systematically, book by book, chapter by chapter, rather than by occurrence, which I tried that and it just about killed me. So
Hmm.
yeah, so that sort of became the way I did it. I put together a whole package. I built my own vocabulary set, including glosses that would work across the whole corpus. And in 2017, I sold that as a little product called Master New Testament Greek. It was basically a set of vocab. We now call it the Greek Vocab Pack. But basically, it was just a way of learning to read the New Testament book by book. And I started from the easiest book, First John, and going to the most difficult one, which I've said is Acts, mostly because Luke Acts is reasonably challenging to read. but also Luke's vocabulary is just massive compared to anybody
Yeah.
else's. So especially with the size of his corpus, like Hebrews is reasonably challenging, but it doesn't have the same corpus size. So you don't have the same number of words. But there are like 511 words that only occur in the book of Acts. That's a lot of
Yeah.
words.
Yeah.
So
That's hard.
yeah, so that's why I put that one last. So, but that's how I kind of got into it, and that's probably
Yeah,
what
I
you
remember
asked
the
for.
last time I was doing a read through the Greek New Testament. Right now, I'm actually just working through Romans, basically paragraph by paragraph, as I'm preaching through the book of Romans at this time. But it was a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half now, that I did a read through of the New Testament. And I remember reading Matthew and feeling pretty good, and Mark pretty good. And Luke is a synoptic gospel. So you're assuming that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are going to be about the same level of Greek level comprehension and difficulty. But Luke is notably harder. And
Mm,
for certain people, it can be quite frustrating because you start to almost shame yourself. Like, I should be better than this. But that's
mm.
because Luke has a substantially more difficult vocabulary. Is that right?
That's a big part of it. Yeah, I think his style is not ridiculously difficult. I mean, it's not. I mean, he's not like a really high. He's well educated, but it's not a really lofty kind of Greek. It's not that we're going to throw everything in different word orders. And on top of that, like you say, it's a synoptic gospel, which means there are stories there that map really easily between the different synoptics. But it's his vocabulary that is significantly larger, even than
Yeah.
Matthew's and Mark's, like you mentioned. Even though Matthew's comparably long, it doesn't have anywhere near as many vocabulary words to learn
Hmm.
and as Luke does. So Luke, I think, has somewhere around 400-ish words. That like it because it's the second to last book in my program, and by the time you get to it, there are still 400 words to learn to be able to read Luke, and then there's another 500 for Acts alone. So yeah, it's still a significant challenge to pick that vocabulary up, and vocabulary is the key to being able to learn fluently. Otherwise you just sort of up and down looking at the reader's text at the bottom, and it just slows you down unbearably.
Last time you and I talked, we were switching roles and you were interviewing me for your
Mm,
channel. Now here I'm interviewing you for my channel. And I described how I fell in love with Greek very early on. I remember hearing one of my pastors preaching and referencing Greek, and just the words themselves captivated my mind. And I couldn't wait to learn Greek
mm.
as an undergraduate at Malone College. And it was my favorite class that I ever took in college, and loved it in seminary too. Did you feel a similar love just immediately for Greek, or was there a process where you kind of had to dip your toe in the water and then your foot, and then you're getting into a cold pool and finally you get used to it? How was the experience of um, becoming a strong advocate for the study of Greek, as well as a lover of the language itself? How was that for you?
Yeah, I think for me it was really the quest for clarity. That sounds really good, doesn't it? Quest for clarity.
Yeah, that's
So
your next book, man.
yeah, yeah. So like I said, I started off like I got saved effectively reading an NIV,
Yeah.
and it was
So did I. So did I, by the way. That was my
yeah,
first translation. Loved
yeah,
it. Haven't read it in a while, but still very fond feelings of my first few read throughs of the Bible. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead. Sorry.
No, you're all good. That's good. And I came across the New American Standard, the 1972 version, a year or two after my conversion, and found that clearer. And that kind of is what set me on this track for, oh, there is actually other translations that will actually help me understand this. And then from there, it really, I guess I went to a number of conferences and things like that. But learning Greek is not something that is really on the radar of anybody in my circles at that time. And New Zealand doesn't really put a lot of stock in academics anyway. Ironically, we have this tall poppy thing where anybody who sort of rises above everybody else sort of gets looked down on, and it doesn't work very
Huh.
well. Yeah, it's weird. That's one of the reasons I love the States is that, that doesn't exist there. And if you do well and, you work hard, it gets recognized. And that's encouraging as opposed to like tearing you down, which is not encouraging. So anyway, so here in New Zealand, there wasn't a lot of that, but we did have American speakers come over. And of course, they would often, as they preach from the New Testament or the Old Testament, they'd talk about the language. And certainly that would have piqued my interest as well. But it was really that, I got to the ESV was released in 2001. I used that for a little while. The New American Standard 95 edition came up. And again, it was still like, and then the Holman Christian Standard Bible came out as well. And you got passages in there like, Jesus says, if anyone is angry with his brother, if anyone says you fool, And the Holman Christian Standard Bible says, anyone says, you moron, and it's like, well, that's a nice colloquialism. And you look up the Greek word and it's like, well, it sounds like that word. Moros is the Greek word, right? So it sounds like the same English word. And so it's like, well, isn't there a better degree of clarity just by learning the language? And so it was that quest for clarity that made me go, you know what, maybe I could just drop the language, the translations entirely and just work from the original. And I do that now in the New Testament. My Hebrew's nowhere near as good as I'd like it to be. But that's really good. So again, you don't, I mean, sure, you have to think about, well, what is the author trying to say? But at least you don't have to deal with that interpretive layer over the top of it, which in my experience makes a huge difference and just makes things clearer.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you just said there. Now, for me, I never really had a King James phase of my early Christianity. For some people, that's the first translation that they read, and some that's the only translation they will ever read. They're absolutely devoted to it. For me, though, because I came into Bible reading through the NIV, which is, an easier translation to read, let's say. It was only later that I began to develop an appreciation for the King James, as well as some of the more antiquated language. How about you? Did you ever go through an infatuation with the King James version, or did you always appreciate a little bit more translational clarity and sort of avoiding some of those
Mm.
more antiquated words and phrases?
Yeah, I think for me, so I wasn't born in a Christian home. I had no Christian heritage growing up. So there was none of that kind of, I'm not sure I'd call it baggage, but you know what I mean by that word, is kind of none of that history and heritage to sort of work my way through. So my first exposure to the New Testament, well, it was probably actually the Good News Bible back when I was 8 years old, but there was really the New Testament and the NIV.
Yeah.
I did go to a church that was pretty small. I was living in a small town at that point, went to a little Open Brethren church. And some people there would pray in King James English. And of course, there was one or two King James Bibles that were being read from. But I found those less than clarifying, should I say, because again, it's not
Hmm.
my native language. I didn't speak 16th century English. And so, that means then that it was all just foreign to me. And I found the NIV clearer and easier to follow. So I never really got into it. I did look at the New King James for a little bit, but it just didn't gel with me. I didn't have any real problem with it, but it just didn't, yeah, it didn't, I don't know why. It's weird when I think about the New American Standard and how I just really loved that translation from the beginning. But the New King James just didn't do it for me for whatever reason at the time. So maybe it was because it had King James on it as well. I don't know. But I certainly
Yeah.
didn't have any natural affinity to the King James, and never. I think I've owned one. I may have one at home, but I've never really had this infatuation for it. So I've not
Just
had
never
to
been
deal
your
with that.
thing.
No.
I think what happens with a lot of us is that wherever we're at in our Christian walk, as we really begin to deepen in our appreciation for God's word, very often we'll start to commit verses to memory and
Mm,
maybe even developing some memory verse note cards, or maybe even attempting to memorize a chapter, a favorite chapter of the Bible or something like that. And whatever we begin to memorize very early on takes on the real cadence for what the text ought to sound like to us. And
mm,
so then whenever we switch translations and we read something new, then there's a few little hitches that just don't sound like the Bible ought to sound to us.
mm,
And so I remember it was about the early 2000s that I switched over from the NIV to the ESV, which became the main translation that I typically preach and teach from today. I had to rememorize certain of my Bible memory verses, often not too much difference, but occasionally a difference of word or phrase. And still, I get tripped up on some of the old NIV verses that I memorized very, very young
mm.
as a young person. So today, Darryl, what would you say is the lay of the land as far as English Bible translations? Is there one that you've come to prefer as the best for reasons of its excellence or its precision or its readability or just its overall devotional style and
Mm.
quality? What would you say you prefer today?
That's a really good question, and I'm thankful you asked that because I've had a number of YouTube videos where I talk about best Bible translation, and I've one of the points of frustration is for those watching those videos, I often don't give one particular one. And the reason for that is the answer to that is quite subjective in many ways, right? Because on the one hand, I really like clarity, which means I tend toward a literal translation of the Bible, but my wife doesn't read very well. And for her, those literal translations are actually not all that helpful for her. She struggles to understand what they're getting at. And so I don't recommend those literal translations for her. She uses a Holman Christian Standard Bible, or probably a CSB now, but she's still got her old one, so whatever. But so my personal preference, I have stuck with the New American Standard until recently when the Legacy Standard Bible came out. The Legacy Standard Bible editors made the right changes, I think, to the New American Standard Bible to make it superior to the New American Standard. So, for example, in Galatians chapter 3, there's this piece where it talks about Abraham and his descendants. And then in the end of the chapter, it talks about Abraham and his seed. And it changes the Greek word or the English translation of that word between those two verses, verse 29 and I think it's verse 14. And that then obscures the actual point of the whole text, because that whole piece there is about how that we're grafted into the Abrahamic covenant. And by using descendants, I don't think that's helpful anyway. But then by using descendants in one place and seed in another, you just completely obscure the meaning or the significance of what Paul is actually getting at. The point of our union with Christ is that because we are in Christ, we share in the Abrahamic covenant, which Christ is the obvious and heir of. And so if you don't make that connection, then you miss that point. And I think the New American Standard did a very poor job of mixing those words up, whereas that's an example of one of the things that I think the Legacy Standard Bible actually fixes so that you can follow the main point a little bit better. So I really like the Legacy Standard Bible. If I'm reading in English now, that's the translation I read from. So there's my personal preference is that. For my family, I think pretty much everybody in my family, my daughters, my wife, they all use the Holman Christian Standard Bible because it's still a very good literal translation. There are some distinctions between the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the Christian Standard Bible. Like they've taken some of the things that were I guess, endearing and annoying about the Holman Christian Standard Bible, like their insistence on Messiah in certain places and whatnot, rather than Christ. And they've sort of smoothed those out a little bit. But I think they've over-compromised a little bit in the New Christian Standard Bible. So not that I'm against the Christian Standard Bible, but my family still loves their Holman Christian Standard Bible because it's very readable, very easy to understand, and still a very good literal translation, reasonably, relatively speaking as well. Certainly, I think it's more literal than the NIV or many of those other dynamic equivalent, or even the ESV, I think, in many ways as well. But yet, it's written for a lower reader age, which makes it easier for the average person. So those are the two that I typically go to, and certainly I like the Legacy. Yeah.
Now, let me give you just a little bit of friendly pushback. You and I are friends, so we can do this to each other. It's not a big deal. What if I push back? I said, of course you're going to say the Legacy Standard Bible because you went to Master Seminary, and that's kind of like that's the Master Seminary translation. Do you think that, and this is probably true for all of us, is there a sense in which we subjectively evaluate these things based on our camps or our preferences or some of our preferred teachers? So is there any sense in which that is true for you in the LSB, or do you think that it is objectively one of the best, most helpful translations that's available today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's two parts to the answer. Let me just answer the question directly rather than give you the other part that's probably a little bit less helpful. And that is that I think that's a fair critique. I think, however, we need to start with where they started with. They started with the New American Standard Bible, which was a very well-respected translation prior to them getting anywhere near it. The
Right.
longevity of
Already
that.
had a great starting point for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, while I concur and agree that every translation has a degree of interpretation in it, you can't avoid that. I don't think their intention or nor the output for that matter was to conform it to any particular theological position. I think there's some particular bents in there. For instance, I think the insistence on translating doulos as slave consistently, it's a game of two halves. I think, okay, I still think that the problem is probably more the English than it is with the Greek. because it's the English word slave that has all the baggage with it, not the word doulos. And I think this is the thing about reading in the original language is it forces you to sort of consider how it would have sounded to the original reader, and so I think, there's a number of things in Greek that don't map that well to our language. And I think that's possibly one of them. So there's some nuances like that that I think are a little bit challenging. And there are one or two instances in the Old Testament in particular where you see the word slave, where I'm not convinced it should be. But again, these are very minor things. And I think it's probably still a better word than bondservant because, again, in English, who knows what on earth a bondservant is? We don't have anything that even maps to that in our culture. So slave is probably still better, but they had different kinds of slaves, and these words map to those different kinds of, servitude, and we just don't have that. So it's just one of those difficult things to get a good, clean map. And I think there's still got to be, even if doulos doesn't mean exactly what we think of when we think of chattel slavery, it's still a closer meaning than whatever bondservant means, which
Yeah.
is again just something that we don't have in our culture. So yeah, so I think they've done a good job, generally speaking. I think it maps better to the way we think as 21st century readers today. I don't think it's theologically loaded. I don't see that there. It was written originally, the original New American Standard was very well received and broadly received, and I think there's no reason why the legacy can't be broadly received as well for the reasons that it's really just a really good translation,
Hmm.
updated faithfully. So that would be my response.
Now, that's fantastic. Probably the thing that the LSB is most noted for is its rendering of the Tetragrammaton as Yahweh or
Mm.
Jehovah is
Mhm.
Yahweh, right, in the LSB. And that's a departure from a lot of translations rendering it as the Lord and sometimes denoting that with Lord in all caps to
Yeah.
indicate that the name Yahweh in the Hebrew was present in the original. What do you think about that as a decision? Personally, I'll tell you first, I like it because it's one of the few translations that actually does that. And I
Yeah.
think that, we're so blessed in the English language. We have multiple translations from everything from rather loose to very strict translations as far as that dynamic equivalence to literalism. We're so blessed. And if a translation is going to spend the money to, come out with a new rendering of the text, it should contribute something to the overall conversation. It should not be another reduplication of something very
Mm.
similar that's already present and available to English readers. So I like the LSB just for that reason, that it does something different. What do you think about that
Mm.
translational choice?
Yeah, another great question. I think that it's jarring. I would say it's, because it's so different to what we read in all our other texts. And I think for that reason, sometimes when I read it publicly, for instance, in our local church, I will sometimes actually switch out Yahweh for Lord
Really?
because
Okay.
not
Interesting. Yeah.
always, not always, but sometimes I will, because it just doesn't. I mean, again, it's jarring, and sometimes I don't want to have that there to unnecessarily distract from the rest of the message. So that's one thing to bear in mind. However, having said that, there's good reason for doing it, right? I mean, if you look at Adonai versus Yahweh, most people don't really pay attention to the fact that the capitalization of Yahweh and Lord actually has a different word behind it. They just read it the same as Adonai, which is Lord. And so as a result of that, they don't actually notice the distinction. And we have this very clear, in Exodus, God says to Moses, actually it's to Israel, I think, in chapter 5 or 6, that, Yahweh is my covenant name, the name which I've given you, by which you may know me. And so I think there's a really good, you know, beginning point to say, well, this is what God has given us to call him by. And so why wouldn't we use that name? So, and I think this, having this disambiguation there does make a big difference in that sense. And that's one of the reasons it's jarring, is we get used to just reading Lord, Lord, Lord. And, that's good and okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with translating it that way, given it's, more than 20 centuries old now. But it's one of those things that I think it's jarring, but I think is a good contribution. So I agree with you in that sense. But I think that wisdom needs to be, it can distract from the text that you're reading at times. And I think wisdom can be exercised. You can easily replace Yahweh with Lord. It's a little bit harder to replace Lord with Yahweh when you're going the other way, particularly because it's easy to miss, and not all translations treat it the same anyway. So I think it's a
Hmm.
good contribution as well. It's one of the two big ones. I think doulos was the other one, but the difference with doulos is that it wasn't the first translation to do that. Whereas I think this is probably the first of the big ones anyway to do this with Yahweh in the Old Testament.
Yeah, if I'm not misremembering, maybe the old American Standard Version, the early 20th century version, likewise uses either Yahweh or I think it's Jehovah actually.
Yeah.
But a text like Psalm 110, where you have the Lord said to my Lord in most translations, whereas in the Hebrew, it's just a little bit more obvious that it's Yahweh said to my Adonai. And it becomes a little bit more clear
Mm.
that we have a messianic prophecy here rather than some kind of like internal conversation in God's own mind or something like that, which the reader could
Yeah.
conceivably miss.
Yeah.
Now, sticking on the topic of translations here for just a moment and our propensity to maybe divide even by camps. The only reason I ask that is because, the ESV recently came out with their updated 2025, and most of the updates were very, very, very minor. I think that they probably improved the Genesis 3 text, which was pretty controversial when they went from for to against and then back again. But here's my point. Somebody posted one of the ESV's early promotional flyers from the early 2000s, and it had on it John Piper, and then it had Matt Chandler and Francis Chan and Mark Driscoll and other persons. And the irony of that post is that a number of those persons had difficulties in ministry. Some had moral failings, others had flamed out, others had become more overtly non-orthodox in their theology. And it was
Mm.
supposed to be kind of like a gotcha moment against the ESV. And, I had to be honest with myself and think back to the early 2000s and think to myself, like, gosh, was I subject to really good promotional material on the part of Crossway and the ESV and ended up preferring that text, or did I make a right decision
Mm.
in choosing that text? Today, some 20 plus years later, I still use the ESV as my preferred preaching text, although I'm using the New King James a lot more than I ever have. My Jonathan Edwards Study Bible project with Thomas Nelson is going to be in the New King James Version. Other writing and translating projects on my own I've done with the New King James Version. And to me, this is where I'm at today, Darryl. I have three preferred translations that I like. I don't really rank them because I like them for different reasons. Okay, so it's not like a
Mm.
best, better, and good.
Mm.
But I like the ESV. It's my it's my dynamic equivalent from a critical text, so I like it for that reason. I like the New King James, which is my modern, again, dynamic or not, or more formal equivalents. I'm sorry, I meant to say
Mhm.
that too with ESV.
Mm.
But from the Textus Receptus, and then I have my King James, which is old school and Textus Receptus. So for me, that triangle gets a little bit of everything. So I've
Mm.
got two modern translations, one from a critical text and one from the Textus Receptus, and then I have a more old-fashioned text from the TR as well. And for me, that pretty much captures everything that I'd want to do in three translations.
Mhm.
That's my theory. Let me throw that out there to you. What do you think about that triangle, and how would you do it different?
Yeah, I think I like your triangle. I think it's very good, very sound. You've got some good thinking in behind that. So I have no trouble with that at all. For my personal preferences, though, um, there's debates over Textus Receptus versus the eclectic texts and whatnot. There's the discussion over formal equivalence versus dynamic equivalence and those sorts of things. I guess I might risk myself here a little bit, but
That's
having
okay. Go for it.
having yeah, I'll incriminate myself on camera.
This is
Um,
this is YouTube, man. This is the Wild
yeah,
West.
yeah,
You can
right.
say anything you want to, and the commenters will say what they want to. So it's all good.
Yeah,
Go for
this
it.
is true. They'll say what they're going to say anyway, so who cares?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit pragmatic when it comes to these sorts of things, and the reason why is, of course, like I mentioned earlier, my wife doesn't read very well. One of my daughters was found reading very, very challenging. She had learning difficulties growing up. And I think, as you review the different translations, the translation committees and the editors, I mean, to even put out a translation today, you actually have to think about where does this fit in the bigger
Yeah.
publication scheme of things, right? I mean, if you're going to aim it for 11-year-olds, well, you're competing with these ones over here. If you're aiming it for adults, well, you're competing with these ones over here. And there's all these sort of subsections, and they're already filled. And so if you're going to bring a new translation to the market, you've got to ask, what are you actually trying to do? What part of the market are you trying to serve? Now, that tells you something to start with, isn't that every one of these translations is designed for a different market. And
Yes.
if you're in that target market, then the translation written for you is the translation you probably want to go buy because it's written for you, that you are the target market for it. So, and that's not to say that, we should all give up on formal equivalents and we should just go and get the message or whatever it happens to be because it's nice and readable. That's not my point. I think generally we should try and get as accurate a translation as possible. However, I think that is offset by the fact that we don't all have the same ability to read. And so I think from a translation point of view, I don't really think that this is one of the reasons I don't get pinned down easily on translations. I'll tell you my preferences and what my family uses, but they've all got different goals. And I think if you bear that in mind, if you're in the target market for one of those, then it's probably ideal for you. And to be fair, most of the publishers are trying for a pretty broad market. So there's a good chance you're going to be in more than one target market, which means you're going to benefit from more than one of those translations should you choose to go down that track, which is what gives us all the choices to begin with, right? So my tendency would be to say, go for as literal a translation as you can easily read and enjoy reading. And then from going back to the text critical issues around the eclectic text versus Textus Receptus, the difference between the Greek texts in these cases is so minimal that I think this is kind of a storm in a teacup. Not to say it's not important, but I think from the average Christian's point of view, we should be looking at this to say, we've got so much in terms of these manuscripts traditions that we can draw on and benefit from and learn from. Why would we even want to start fighting over this stuff, Sure, translate from one over another and all those kinds of things. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But again, it's just the difference. We're not talking about the difference between a dynamic equivalent and a formal equivalent translation. The differences aren't that great between your Greek text. So it's really just, you know, very, very minor tweaks and changes here and there. And it's really the plethora of manuscripts that gives you the vast number of differences that we have rather than actually the quantity of differences between any two given manuscripts. So I don't really, so from I guess, hence my pragmatic kind of element, how much does it really matter what Greek text you're working from? I don't really, I don't have any problem with people working from a Textus Receptus. I don't have any problem working with a classical, with an eclectic text. Those are fine with me.
Sure.
So I don't have any problem with that. I don't see any reason to split over these things or have big debates and arguments. Sure, debate them, from an academic point of view, that's beneficial because we all learn from that. But again, if we're in the trenches and we don't read Greek, it's a never mind kind of question in my mind because the
Yeah.
distinctions are so small it doesn't matter. So
Yeah.
that's probably, again, I'm over answering your question, but hey,
No, that's
that's
great. I
me.
love it. I love it. Yeah. Apologies to the reader here. I made a mistake a few minutes ago when I was talking about dynamic versus formal equivalent. You probably understand if you're in the know, you're in the know. But let's actually work backwards for just a minute, Darryl, because we've got you on the line here, and you are a legitimate Greek scholar. We're talking about English translations from the Greek. What if we were doing it the other way, Darryl? What if you were the translator and you've got your Greek text? And you're going to try to render it into the English. What kind of a translation philosophy would you choose to use if you were making the translation? In other words, suppose Thomas Nelson or Crossway calls you up and they say, "Hey, Darryl, we got a project for you. We're going to need a translation, but we need some suggestions from you as to nuance and style and formal versus dynamic." How would you go about rendering a Greek text into English?
That's not a question I've ever been asked before, so it's interesting. Shooting from the hip, I would probably still tend to want to be pretty consistent with the original. So the key question is, what is the original author trying to say? And I think I would want to be as close, try and represent that as clearly as possible. There are going to be idioms in particular that, don't map. If you make those literal, it's going to be just no fun to read. So I would want to smooth some of those things out. Like, when a demon comes to Jesus and says, "What is it to you and to me?" The literal dative usage of the pronouns there. Well, what is it to you and me? We don't say it that way. So I would want to rephrase that for English. Um, so I think I'd want to have reasonably literal. The key thing is, am I capturing the author's intent in terms of the understanding they want me to take away from this? That's not always easy. And one of the most challenging things I think with any translation is how do you surface the cultural assumptions that are present for the original authors that are lost for us? And one of the ones I've talked about recently on my YouTube channel is patronage, right? We don't have patronage today. Patronage is where you have a patron who then provides some sort of resources, finances, favors, whatever it is, and thereby some elevated social status to a patron, to a client, effectively.
Yes.
So that person then benefits, and they reciprocate within that. And this is all normal cultural stuff. It's kind of like I scratch your back, you scratch my back kind of stuff. But this is a legitimate part of the culture, and we look down on that in our culture today. It's kind of like just, it's I don't know, we've got all sorts of terms for it, right? That are normally quite negative in our language. But this was a normal part of the social strata of the first century Greco-Roman world. And so there are places like Philippians 4, which is another video I did just recently, where Paul actually, I think this is what sits behind Philippians 4 to inform the way he's talking to them. He doesn't thank them for their gift. Because I think if he does that, then he's actually playing the client to them being a patron. And so he's very careful about the way he words all of this. And I think, therefore, how do you surface that in a translation? I don't think it's easy to do that. So I would probably want to have some really good notes to try and surface some of those elements as we go through. So I'd probably want to be fairly literal, dynamic where it doesn't make sense to be literal. But I would want to have good solid notes there to sort of provide some supporting information underneath it. Not a study Bible kind of thing. I think that would be
Yep.
too much, but just enough to sort of say, sitting in behind this is the current stuff. Maybe there'd be some appendices to refer to or whatever. And that would get even more tricky once you get into the Old Testament. You start talking about some things like covenants and things like that, which are things, again,
Yeah.
I've done a bit of research into my doctoral work, which I'd want to sort of be clear about in there as well. So that would be my kind of desire, I think.
You mentioned patronage as a New Testament concept. Have you, by the way, read David De Silva's Patronage, Kinship? I forget the rest of the title. Did you read that book?
Yes, I did. Very, very good book.
Yeah, he's one of my seminary professors at Ashland Theological Seminary. So he stressed a lot of those basic social construct ideas that are just kind of either foreign to us today or outmoded in today's modern
mm.
culture.
And I think that, this is where a lot of these exegetical commentaries are great on the exegesis, but they don't necessarily spend as much time as I think I'd like them to see anyway in the background. So I know there's Bible background commentaries and stuff, but typically I don't find those to be a lot better. They tell you stuff you probably already know anyway, but they don't go into some of these things like honor. How does honor work within that society? Kinship and those kinds of things as well, which another more De Silva and what he talks about. Those sorts of elements are really important. And I think, we've actually got to think this isn't stuff that we can just sort of like read the New Testament and say, oh, I kind of see how all of this works together. We've actually got to sit down and think, how does the honor, does the honor culture or does the patronage culture actually play a role in this? And that takes a lot more thought, and investigation and so on. So it's not as easy, I think, as we would like it to be.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Greek, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to share some of your social media and things like that, some of your projects that you're working on currently, because you have a lot to share. In fact, I love your website because you have stuff that can educate people of various levels. And I really appreciate that about you. In that sense, you and I are trying to do the same thing from different angles. We both want people to be edified
Mhm.
and encouraged in Christ. And so thank you for all that you do. But I have to ask about your love for Greek. How are you incorporating your study and translation of Greek into your own life? And if I can subdivide that question, let's talk about your personal devotions. Let's talk about any church ministry type functions as an elder, perhaps. and then maybe a little bit more academic pursuit. So does that question make sense?
Sure. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. So my original goal for getting into Greek was to be able to learn to read it so I could read it in my devotional time. And so I finished learning all the vocabulary for the New Testament back in about 2018, I think it was. I continued to review for a few years after that, just sort of keep up to date, make sure I don't forget them easily. And now I just read from the Greek text and I don't really review any more vocabulary. So my daily Bible reading, I use Logos Bible software for my reading plan. I use a little iPad Pro, iPad Mini it is, to just sort of read from. At the moment. It changes occasionally. So I've got videos on my YouTube channel about devotions and stuff and how I've done those over the years. But right now I'm reading on an iPad and I've developed a plan for reading through the New Testament in the order it was written. So
Cool.
currently I'm reading through the Greek New Testament in the order that it was written. And of course, there's debate over that. So I've put my own ordering together. From a church ministry point of view, I preach several times a year in our local church. We have a full-time pastor. That's not me. And so I fill in for him occasionally. Normally works out to somewhere between 6 and 10 times a year. And so, of course, when I'm doing my preparation for that, it's all from the Greek New Testament. Occasionally, I might dip into an Old Testament text. There's a few spots around that I've sort of spent a lot of time in the Old Testament. And so I've got sermon series or sermons on those. And so I've done those. But for the most part, I personally, yeah, I think there's no match for preaching from the original language. And this is where I think, when I went to seminary, they teach you to exegete the text. But I think there's actually a really good case to be made for reading the text as well. If you just exegete the text, there's a risk that you develop this artificial understanding of how the language is working. And I think that actually undermines your ability to follow arguments and ensure you're actually treating the grammar properly, because it's tempting to go off on a grammatical flight of fancy if you don't have the reading to keep you sort of, fenced in so that you don't go off into a tangent. So, and not only that, but reading allows you to follow the argument as well. So rather than just sort of following this set of 4 verses or whatever it is, you're actually thinking about this in its whole context. So I thoroughly recommend that. Of course, you got to learn to study as well, because you need to understand the syntax and the grammar and those sorts of things to be able to sort of think carefully about how the author is constructing his argument. But nonetheless, I think both of those together is what you really want. So from a ministry point of view, I work directly from the original texts. I develop my sermon outlines directly from the original text as well. So normally it's like, what are the finite verbs? What are the other components within the text? Looking for things like, something like, for instance, in Ephesians 5, verse 18 and following, there's this one finite verb followed by a bunch of participles that then provides you with your outcome. Your finite verb is your main point, if you like, your proposition, if you want to put it that way. And then your participles are going to be your subpoints, your outline points as you go through. And you might do that over 2, 3, 4 sermons, whatever is appropriate. So that's kind of how I work that. I preach occasionally in other sermons in other churches in New Zealand. And I tend to just redo sermons. I write my sermons out from manuscript, and that means that it allows me just to focus on creating content and whatnot for members in our membership. So yeah, and that's what we kind of do as well. Just going back to, we've got content for all sorts of people at all sorts of levels. We actually have a quiz. If you go to bma.to/get started, we have a little quiz there that will ask you where you're at and then recommend to you, based on all the stuff we have available, here's some options that might get you underway. So bma.to/get started.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, you have a real passion for teaching regular people how to read and to translate
Mm.
Greek. That is your bread and butter for the most part, though you do many things well. That is one of the things that you've concentrated quite a bit of your adult, academic, and professional life around. Why don't you tell us in summary and roundup here, what are some of the ways that we can find your content? What are some of the ways that people can learn from the materials that you've put together over the years? And give us a little bit more about where we can get stuff from you, especially your New Testament Greek learning tools.
Mm. So that's a great question. So we're always thinking about how do we improve how we serve. Our goal is to increase the knowledge level of the original language, and I think the culture of the first century as well, so people can read and study the scriptures in the original language with knowledge, with understanding, with clarity, with confidence. That's really what we are about. So we know that not everybody is ready to learn Greek. We have a beginning Greek Well, it's what we call it. We call it the basic Greek skills course, which will help you to learn how to pronounce Greek words properly using modern Greek pronunciation, and then we'll teach you how to do some basic studies with the Greek text, even though you're not actually learning the language itself. Then we have our full-on membership. I've written my own beginning Greek grammar, which is designed for people who've got ministry work and family commitments. So, beginning Greek in small steps. That's not been published. We're I've been on the fence about publishing it for some time. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, but certainly it's available for our
What's
members
holding you
inside.
back, Darryl? Come on, you can make a big announcement right here on the Matthew Everhard channel on
Yeah,
YouTube.
I've reached out to one or two publishers and haven't had anything back yet. And I think, there's publishers like Zondervan who've got three or four different Greek grammars already. Lexham have got two. They said, yeah, sure, if you can make it stand out. And I think I could, but I haven't gone back to them. And I reached out to another one recently, but haven't heard back yet. So I haven't, but even so, even anyway, so nothing to announce there. But you can get it if you join our membership. You get it for free as you go through our course. I've got videos and lessons and all that kind of stuff available there as well. And then we have Hebrew and whatnot too. So we have our basic Greek skills course, which is for people who are not sure if they want to learn Greek, but they just want to sort of dabble. Then we have our membership, which will take you from knowing nothing all the way through to being able to read the New Testament. And of course, then we have our premium languages, which gives you both Hebrew and Greek for that same goal as well. And the best way to get into it is really just to go to bma.to/get started. Check out our website, biblicalmastery.academy, and follow us on YouTube. We've got a YouTube channel. Just search for, it's just at BMA, I think. So youtube.com/@BMA, and you'll find us there as well. And there's loads of free stuff as well on our website at biblicalmastery.academy as well.
That's awesome. Well, the next time we talk, Darryl Burling, I'm going to talk you out of using traditional publishers and talk you into all of the virtues of independent publishing. I really think that the old world is passing away as it relates
Mm.
to major media on one hand and also major traditional publishers on the other hand. So I'm going to try to talk you into going independent with that great work. It sounds like something that would really benefit a lot of people. And my
Well, it's funny
experience
you
is
should say that. I have been seriously toying with self-publishing it. So,
I off when we get off the line here, I'll try to talk
okay.
you into it. I've got some reasons why you should do that, but I've done both. I've done traditional publishing, and there's certain projects that I will still do that for. For instance, there's no way that I could do my Jonathan Edwards Study Bible if I didn't have a major publishing team like we have at Thomas Nelson, editors, all kinds of graphic people, layout people, design people, marketing people, not to mention publishing the Bible is a major project, the paper, the
Mm,
cost, the sewing, the leather. I could never do that. But
mm,
there are other books that independent publishing makes so much more sense from a logistical and even a financial economic perspective for the sake of the author
mm.
that you might want to look into that. And I will talk you into that next time we talk. But
Okay.
hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation with Darryl Burling. Darryl, parting thoughts? Anything else you want to let us know before we hang up the call?
No, I appreciate your time, Matt. It's always a joy and a blessing to talk with you. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm very thankful to be able to I mean, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. So thank you for all you do and for your time today.
Yeah, well, you are welcome, my man, and thank you so much as well. It's the blessing and the pleasure of modern technology that not only can we catch up our friendship like this and just talk for an hour or so, but also record it and post it for the world to be benefited from it. I hope people learn from what they heard today. That's it for right now. Matthew Everhard checking out. Darryl Burling from New Zealand checking out. Thank you so much for checking in with us today. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.